Mr. Tunde Lemo was a former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. Of course, beyond that, you may also check it out. He was also a chairman of the Abuja Securities and Exchange Commission, and he served in a number of other capacities, including FEMA. So he's someone who understands not just how monetary policy runs, but how the economy should run. He's live here in the studios with us this Boxing Day. Good morning, sir. It's good to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your time, dragging folks like you out of your deserved holiday period. But again, this is very important. We talk about growth all the time, and we want growth. Whether you grow your bank account, or you're making growth by age, or you're growing by professional qualifications, or new appointments and things like that. So growth, we want growth in life, and everybody wants it. So as a country, we want the economy to grow. But oftentimes we discuss the GDP numbers and using that, but it looks like the mantra is changing from GDP growth to inclusive growth. So what's your understanding about inclusive, what you call an inclusive growth economy?
Thank you, Bosin. You are very, very right in the sense that up until recently, Nigerians thought growth should be celebrated with raw GDP numbers. But it's been made very, very clear that raw GDP numbers may not be the best barometer to see growth, particularly if you're looking at a densely populated country like Nigeria. The Human Development Index actually did prove that just raw growth in Nigeria may not deliver what we expect that people will have in terms of well-being. And that is why we began to look at employment-generating growth. And unfortunately, because of the structure of our economy, Nigerian economy, even though oil and gas is less than 10%, has been providing the bulk of the growth. And most of this is externalized. The people on the street don't feel the impact. So today, it's important that policymakers should actually redirect our efforts at creating jobs. And this then means that we need to invest in job-friendly activities, activities that will actually mean that will begin to attack the unemployment figures, and then that is where you can directly see the impact on the well-being of the people.
But the big numbers do matter, don't they?
Of course they do.
The big numbers.
They do, but provided, of course, the numbers also would cascade to delivering well-being of the people. If you just look at the big numbers, for instance, in Nigeria, the Gini coefficient actually tells us that most of these big numbers go to the big boys. So when a billionaire makes additional billions and trillions, that does not actually help economic development. It doesn't help the man on the street. It doesn't deliver social values. And so, yes, big numbers on the one hand, but on the other hand is how is this big number distributed? What are the activities that actually engage people in terms of productivity and employment? US, for instance, tackles this every time they track employment job increases, which is why you see those numbers roll out. Every month, US will celebrate, additional 20,000, additional 100,000 jobs are created because they understand this impact.
Those jobs are created by the private sector or by the government?
Of course, US is a private sector-led economy, so most of these jobs are created by the private sector, but of course the government provides the enabling environment, and I think Nigeria should learn from this. Nigeria should not just think that the president will throw money at unemployment and then jobs will be there. No, nobody expects government to provide jobs. That, of course, is, even the former socialist economists have since discarded that. But government should provide the enabling environment for private sector to create jobs.
How do we do this? How do we transit from what we've done for nearly 60 years of a public service-led economy to a private sector-led economy? How do we unlink this and lock in the private sector in there as the engine for this inclusive growth? It looks like a very difficult thing to do. It's
not difficult, Bosin. The journey actually has started. If you look at the way we transited from 1999 up until 2007, we began to make progress in the sense that the government began to free up resources into the private sector. Look at what happens in telecoms. Look at what happens in so many other sectors. Private sector, most of these assets that were not well utilized by the government business concerns were privatized. And then through privatization, you look at the revolution that has happened in cement. We thought before, I mean, you heard of Cement Armada when we were importing cement into the country. But today, the major cement producer in Nigeria has become major cement producer for Africa. And the same thing can be replicated. All the government needs to do is to provide infrastructure. The major constraint to the private sector delivering this employment number is because of decaying infrastructure that we have seen year on year. Today, for instance, the global economy is estimated to spend about 20 trillion on infrastructure this year, which is approximately 20% of GDP. But today, Mr. President just gave us the budget, and $6.22 billion capital expenditure, which may not necessarily be infrastructure. But let's assume that is a proxy for infrastructure. That is less than 2% of our GDP. And so we're really not dealing with infrastructure as seriously as we should.
But the current administration is doing some roads and rail. And do you think maybe in 2, 3, 4 years down the line, we would begin to see the private sector benefit from these investments?
Well, you're right. The current administration has been trying. In fairness, in the last 3 years, so much has gone into roads and rail. But at the end of the day, when you sum it up, it's just a tip of the iceberg. We need a lot more investment. Today, we're still talking about Kano-Kaduna rail and so on and so forth. Imagine, I mean, the entire Nigeria 774 local government. All we need to do is create that environment whereby every naira that the public sector puts into road or rail infrastructure, that can attract another 99 naira from the private sector.
How do we make that happen? How do we make that happen? Policies, action, what? MOUs?
Policies, MOUs, PPP. PPP models, there are different models all over the country, all over the world. I like the model in Brazil. I mean, Brazil has actually used PPP to develop infrastructure, particularly during the administration of President Lula. And today, when you look at the infrastructure revolution in Brazil, it's all been powered by private sector majorly, but government will provide the enabling environment. Look at the experiment we wanted to do, the Lekki second toll gate. For one reason or the other, there was a rollback. I mean, maybe it wasn't well thought out, but at the end of the day, if we do it well, there are so many major roads that we can privatize in Nigeria. When you provide global capital, you quickly transform infrastructure, and that is when you can then get Nigerian manufacturing concerns to be globally competitive. Today, everybody produces for the global market. If you are not competitive, then of course, not just that you will not be able to meet the local consumption, even those who produce better, those who are more efficient in other climes, will bombard your market with cheaper goods. About 20, 30 years ago, there were over 127 textile companies in Nigeria, from China, from India. Where are they today? They've all gone back to their climes. In those days, Nigeria was a better country to produce in terms of infrastructure. But what happened, there was a decay between the 70s, 80s, and so all those textile companies are back in India and China.
Where is this issue or problem for a PPP arrangement that bring the private sector in between the government and the private sector? Is there a mistrust there? Is there an integrity issue, integrity of contracts, consistency? We've talked all about all of this. How do you think we'll resolve this particular issue? Because in the same country, if we're finding it difficult to attract private capital within the domestic economy, that's a very big issue.
Government must respect contract agreement. I mean, let's sit down and look back in the past 5, 6, 7 years. Have there been occasions when we signed the dotted line and then we had cause to unwind what we did? Because that sends negative signal. Some of it is trust, but of course, another issue is how well you package it. PPP cannot be done by the bureaucrats just sitting there in Abuja and thinking through what has to happen. Is to actually get investment banks, all over the globe, the likes of JP Morgan and those other clients. Even in Nigeria, we are beginning to develop skills and competencies. Africa Finance Corporation, for instance, that was set up to catalyze development of infrastructure all over Africa, can actually be a pivotal institution to drive this initiative. And in the past 10 years that they have been in existence, you've seen their footprints all over Africa. And a lot more can be done if government will sit down with them and get things done.
Yeah, because you're a director. You were a director on Africa Finance Corporation. What was your experience there, say, about the Nigerian environment and other African countries? Why does it look like, whether it is EFC or EFDB or others, projects, PPP projects seems to move very fast in other climes, even within the continent, than it moves in Nigeria?
Because in the public sector, generally, they take their time. You see, time is money in other climes. I mean, when in AFC, for instance, we've done business with Gabon and so many other countries. And then some of these, by the time you go for 2-3 meetings, it's all over. But here in Nigeria, you have to wait for approvals. You have to get the legislators to make things happen. And some of these things might take forever. I believe that if we can become a bit more efficient, we can also be able to get in global capital through some of these efforts.
Is the private sector in Nigeria ready for this?
The private sector is ever ready.
Does the private sector have money in Nigeria, really?
When
look at the big government is the big brother. Here.
There's a lot of...
It looks like the rest of us are... I'm trying to find if I have cash, but looks like government has all the money, pays all the salaries, share the FAC, do bailout for state governments and everyone. So it looks like the government is still the one who has that deep pocket and the ability to raise the money.
There's a lot of money in the private sector, but the bulk of this money still goes to government because of what we call fiscal dominance. Most of it, of course, is invested in treasury bills. Some of this money, if we have other investment vehicles that are more competitive than treasury bills, you can still mobilize private sector funding. Besides that, I think the Nigerian capital market is becoming more and more developed. We will not have real estate capital market issues. So it all depends on the structuring. I believe we can still draw private capital. But today, nobody talks about private capital anymore. We talk about global capital. Global capital moves to where there are opportunities. And so for every naira of local capital, you can also get a lot more globally.
When we come back after the break, we want to continue a little bit on the markets side to fund infrastructure and other things. Then, more importantly, you spend some of your time since you left office in your alma mater, as it were. So we want to know a little bit about human capital investing, education, skills, and things like that. Stick around. Former Deputy Governor, the Central Bank.